Good evening. Very nice to see people turning up on Thursday evening. My name is Dorian Chang. I'm the Artistic Director and Chief Curator here at M+. It is an enormous privilege to welcome you this evening for a very precious opportunity to have Sir Peter Cook at M+ and in Hong Kong and to hear directly from him. We would like to thank Royal Institute of British Architects for supporting this event by bringing Sir Cook to Hong Kong and to Shenzhen. We have invited Sir Peter Cook to speak today about the beginnings of Archigram in 1960s Britain. You know, of course, that Peter Cook is one of the founders of Archigram, alongside Warren Chalk, Dennis Crompton, David Greene, Herron, and Michael Webb. In the group's work, architecture was about change, possibilities, and alternatives, but initially they were largely seen as a peripheral agitant to the architectural mainstream. The last 5 decades have, however, shown the broader influence and relevance of Archigram's speculative projects. As one of the earliest to explore architecture's engagement with transformations in urbanism, technology, and popular culture, and to address the rise of the user-consumer in a globally interconnected and hypermediated world, Archigram left an indelible mark on how architectural practice is understood in relation to society. This is evident in the work of generations of practitioners, both within and outside architecture. In 2019, after a long discussion and dogged efforts over many years, M+ acquired the Archigram archive for the museum's collection. And in November 2020, to mark the momentous event, M+ organized the online and offline symposium Archigram Cities with the University of Hong Kong Faculty of Architecture and the Power Station of Art in Shanghai. The symposium involved Archigram members, architects, and scholars to expand the readings of Archigram's practice with transnational and cross-disciplinary perspectives. The stellar lineup of participants at the time included Professor Young-Ho Chang, the eminent architect and the Dean of Faculty of Architecture at the University of Hong Kong, whom we have the pleasure of inviting tonight again to join the special event. So now I'd like to invite Shirley Surya, the M+ Curator of Architecture, to come up and give us a sense of what we can expect from Sir Peter's presentation and his dialogue with Professor Chang. Thank you.
Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Shirley. I just wanted to say that we titled this event Control and Choice. Of course, is the title of the work that you see here, but it's also got to do with the nature of this event. Oftentimes, we just cannot control what Peter's going to say. So even though I can share with you the outline of what he's going to say and the conversation he'll have with Professor Young-Ho Chang, I think I can still say it, and if you can choose to follow it. But if you want to go somewhere else, it's fine too. So what we ask Peter to share tonight, which you will see in the next slide, will be really just talking about the kind of a background of Archigram. Like, I think a lot of people see a lot of images and works of this group and all the different individuals, but no one really understands the context. And so I think we really wanted to ask, some of the questions that, what were the forces? What were the phenomena within and outside architecture at that time that motivated the conception of Archigram and its activities across various kind of mediums, so publishing, teaching, exhibition making. Right? And we also wanted to ask about what were the means and methods that Archigram undertook to disseminate these ethos, different kind of ethos or design propositions, and to what effect. I think you may not be able to address all this, but we were curious about these things. And also, what were the ideas behind some of the kind of like very canonical works that you see? Plug-in City, Blowout Village, Instant City, all of these that are designed by Peter as well as the other members. And how do these works intend to inspire or even challenge architects at that time? And of course, the discussion that we're trying to encourage tonight with Professor Young-Ho Chang and Peter is also to ask about what does this mean today? right? What do these kind of works mean today? Or even how do they react to that time, inspire or challenge how we react to our times? I guess that's what we are. If you do have a chance to consider and reflect on these, please do share your thoughts. And so that's kind of what we hope. And of course, Professor Yong Ho Chang is very unique. I think what's similar between the two of you, and of course, you're going to bring up something that is pretty much an overlapping moment in 1977, which you will share later, is really about the intersection of architecture and also the artistic practice even, or the kind of artistic thinking, or even a kind of criticality. What does that mean? And also not just being involved as a builder, as an architect, as a practitioner, but also as someone who imagines or who deals with literature, writing, or even exhibition making, and of course, teaching. So all of these kind of like roles, I think is unique. Not every single architect takes on all these different dimensions, and that's why we invite the two of you to have a conversation, and hopefully that will flower up new topics. And then, of course, in the last 20 minutes or about then, we're going to open it up to all of you to ask questions. But before that, we're going to have Peter to really share. So Peter, please. Mike.
So there's a lot to get through, and I've kept the number of slides fairly short because some of the things can't really be explained except anecdotally or as kind of sound pictures of an atmosphere. And I think the approach to this from sitting here is very different from a lecture that I gave 2 days ago, which is about what has happened since, and tomorrow nights will be even an extended version of that with some rather more jokey things in it, because my activities since Archigram have continued to be for much of the time teaching, and surprisingly some of the time building. And so suddenly the notion, and this is a sort of hobby horse of mine somewhat, the notion that there were a whole lot of people in London in the Archigram period and immediately afterwards who were largely associated with the AA school and other such places, who did drawings and exhibited drawings in galleries and made what the Russians called paper architecture, and there's a whole group of them doing such things. In fact, because it was convenient to the mainstream world, perhaps, that they never did build, that you could be put into a pigeonhole. You were a sort of thinker, artist, drawer, conceptualist, utopian, perhaps. And then what happened was that gradually some of us started building. And then these same people, and the buildings didn't particularly cost that much more than anybody else's buildings, and they didn't particularly leak any more than anybody's buildings. And then it was very hard, I think, for the mainstream, because they couldn't fall back on the thing saying, well, you're some different kind of animal. They said, well, yes, And I think I make this point strenuously before I start, because I think I think several of us amongst the 6 people never really thought that what we were doing was detached from architecture. And of course, 2 or 2.5 of the people had already built substantial buildings and knew all about dealing with building buildings in the damp country called England, etc. But the background, of course, is much more than this. And I think I have to state immediately that there were 10 years difference between the oldest member of Archigram and the youngest. And I think that's significant, because when you're young, 10 years is a long time. Now it doesn't feel, most of my friends are 20 years younger than me, but bless. But at that time, it meant a lot. It meant that Warren Chalk had experienced being a child, not only a child within the war, but a teenager during the war years. Ron Herron was a little bit younger, but was the only one who had been in national service. He was talking down American aircraft in Berlin. That was his job. The rest of us were wet behind the ears. We had not been in the war. We did not go in national service. And I'm very still remembering that at college, people who had been in the war treated us as children. I mean, we were children. We'd heard bombs perhaps and things like that, but we'd never fought. We did have food rationing. And I won't dwell on that too much, but you have to put into the fact that I have still memories of bombs landing in Coventry, which is a nearby city to where I lived, and me jumping into bed with my parents because I was scared. But I never remember being dive bombed, which apparently we were when I was about 2 or 3 or something. I don't remember that because it was in another town. And actually that period for me personally was not unenjoyable. There was crappy food, dried bananas, dried egg, and very little meat. But, we survived. We had free orange juice and milk. And let's see if this works. Yes, so Britain in the 1950s was a strange place. I can still remember, I don't really remember any bomb damage as extreme as this. But clearly there was, because by the time I was had moved to London from the provinces, there were still bomb sites. And I think the last bomb site I remember as such was filled in about 3 years ago. But they virtually disappeared 20 years ago. But so there's some, in the street where we live, which is a red brick Edwardian street, there are 3 flat-roofed buildings of varying quality because that's where bombs landed, and there's a lot of railways behind us, and they were mostly accurately destroyed. But this thing of the bomb site means that, of course, not like cities like Warsaw, which was sort of obliterated and then completely rebuilt, but there are patches of London which look to be old and in fact fake old. There are patches of London which you'll have a street with a certain degree of homogeneity, then suddenly there's something you say, what the hell was going on there? It was in fact a bomb site that had to be replaced. Now the early, the example on the right, I picked not because it's the worst thing that was going on when I was an early student, but is a sort of, in fact, by that standard, it's probably not by no means the worst, but it's typical of this sort of English, let's rebuild with solidity in public buildings, and then let's build with as sort of little decent materials we can get away with for housing. And I'm not going to make a big song and dance of that, simply to try and put it to perspective what the period was. And so since Archigram always was a coalition of 6 people's position, and I've said many times, there wasn't a gay, but there were many varieties of girlfriend. There were many varieties of clothing. There were several varieties of taste in music. Probably a fairly consistent taste in art, in that we were spectators, albeit that Warren Chalk and David Greene, as with many young architects, really wanted to be painters. And Warren Chalk actually managed to con his parents into thinking that he was in the architecture department of the Manchester College of Art, whereas in fact he was doing painting, until his brother told the parents and shot and shipped him. And David Greene, I think it was more straightforward. He went to art school and hung out with the art students. And interestingly, some years later, after having been in America for a while, did teach back in his original art school, which by this time was called something else, in Nottingham, and got very involved with a particular group of English political artists who were very busy at Nottingham Art School in and around the 1980s. But I slightly digress. But what I'm saying is, and I'll add to that point in a moment. The other influences, of course, were the effect of the Second World War, the dare I say, positive effect particularly of the technologies of the Second World War and of the attitude towards the dynamics of objects. The most extreme example, the most interesting example, is that of Neville Barnes Wallis, shown on the left here, who invented the Wellington bomber and the bouncing bomb, this famous bomb that was able to bounce on the water and then destroy a dam. And the Wellington bomber was the conspicuous use of lamellar construction as a kind of geodesic construction. And I couldn't find the right slide, but there is a famous slide somewhere of a Wellington bomber flying home after a bombing raid with enormous great hole in the fuselage and still carrying on because of the nature of the lamellar construction to resolve weak part, to deal with the stresses. And of course, it was a wooden airplane, and this stuff was going on. I had a particular teacher at one point who had been a glider pilot, and was very interested in these things, and explained and used to give us sort of not exactly lectures but conversations about the tremendous effect of glue in the building industry, and how the composites of timber in layers glued together made enormous breakthroughs in the ability to deal with spaces and so on. And we were the children of that. It was already rolling. The other thing, which I won't digress on too far because it's a long-winded story, was, of course, the British fascination with pre-stressing. And, of course, there have been some conspicuous failures of pre-stressed concrete buildings, but mainly due to bad construction. But it tended to get pre-stressing in a bad name. But the notion that you could take a sort of a muddy constituent and pre-stress it and then hold it through these virtually wires running through it is dynamically very interesting. And I think I hadn't talked about this before ever, actually, but it seems to me that there was a certain breakthrough running parallel to other theories and positions that have often been discussed, whereby the attitude towards material and towards weight and towards the interdependence of different constituent parts, particularly those which can be mobilized or can be pulled or can be stretched or can be post-tensioned, was happening during that period. Now, the middle slide is of a thing called the Skylon, which is ostensibly designed by two, at the time, rather interesting architects called Powell and Morey. These are all people senior to my generation. They would still be even older than Warren, but they were the sort of hot kids around town in the period when I was maybe a first-year student or thereabouts. And the engineer was somebody called Felix Samueli. And without digressing too far, again, another thing that has affected our period, I think, has been the engineering tradition in London, which is extremely strong, even though I have to say my favourite engineer to work with still now is a German engineer called Klaus Bollinger. But there are these brilliant British engineers, and Samueli was the engineer for the Skylon, this mast that was held. And that the same that his protege, Frank Newby, was the engineer on the birdcage done by Cedric Price and Lord Snowdon. So the Samueli line runs down one side, and after Newby was Tony Hunt, and after Tony Hunt was a number, AKT in fact, which is another firm that I work with sometimes. On the other side was the Arab lineage, which went through Happold and Peter Rice and down to various people that came out of that school. And there were these two strong schools of these two firms. Arabs, of course, has become the more famous, and now Biro Happold pops out of, I think, the right-hand side, the Arab one. Anyhow, this isn't a lecture about the progeny of English engineers. But I want to fill that in as a sort of background that's not normally associated with Archigram, except when you think about some of the things that were being referred to. Jumping on to something else then is the coffee bar scene. What I remember, both as a provincial and then eventually coming to London, is that the coffee bars are the equivalent now of the sort of pub or the coffee house. And the one in the top middle was one that I actually used, the Witch's Cauldron in Belsize Village, for anybody who knows that part of town. And it's now a Greek restaurant and rather boring. That was the basic AA hangout. And there was a parallel coffee bar in South Kensington in Exhibition Road called Hades, interesting, the Witch's Cauldron on the one and Hades on the other, which was the hangout of the Royal College of Art. And there was a lot of traffic between the two. A lot of RCA people were friends of AA people. And these two coffee bars, one in Kensington, one in Lower Hampstead, were the sort of core of the scene as I remember it arriving in London. On the right-hand side, looks a rather boring slide, was actually one that was important to the generation a bit before me, which was the hangout of the AA Marxists, and I forget its name now. Whatever it's called. Partisan, yes, the Partisan. I think I went in it once, and then I think I caught it at the very tail end. But that is very important in the history of the AA, and Plan magazine was hatched, I think, at the Partisan. The other two, I think the picture at the bottom gives you a very good idea of the sort of clothing. And what strikes me, looking at it now, that it's not very far away from straight up and down clothing. I think that as the 60s developed, and even into the 70s, clothing became more eccentric. But if you look at it, it's only just a bit sort of slightly tacky version of, they're sort of white linen shirts taken outside the trousers rather than being very interesting shirts in themselves, kind of thing. And in terms of architecture, the building on the left, I think, is part of Park Hill, Sheffield, which is often referred to as being a wonderful building. I think it looks rather dreary. And that is an interesting fact that many of the products of even the most interesting architects at the time didn't look very pretty. I'd even dare to say that I remember giving a lecture in one of the Smithson's buildings in Bath. And I'd been a great admirer of the Smithsons. I'll come on to that a bit later. But in fact, it was not a very good building, but one wanted it to be because they themselves were interesting. And I think that occasionally there were gems, and I still, the other day in Norwich at the University of East Anglia, the bottom right slide of the ziggurat blocks done by Lasdon, with some other people like Ted Cullinan, etc., helping him. I think that is a remarkably good building. They're trying to sort the building out right now, and there's a competition, which I will certainly not enter, for people to sort those, make them workable. But they're brilliant buildings, and they're not just iconic, they are really, I think, urban gems. But they were at the tail end of this period, so very occasionally something rather brilliant would emerge. But most of the stuff looks like the two things on the left, very ho-hum. Now, I am sure, not only because of David Greene and Warren Chalk, but I myself also went to an art school, architecture school, for the first 3 years. And considerably hung out with the art students. And there was a very influential magazine called Arc, produced by the Royal College of Art, of which I can't find a slide of the key issue, and I've lost my copy. But there was a very special one edited by Dennis Postel, who was the man who made the Archigram film that's showing upstairs in the exhibition. And he did an Arc magazine which was sort of had holes rasped into the cover and used day glow and all sorts of things which were very new at the time. But Arc magazine, if you track it back, there were early articles by Rainer Banham about the London bus and other things. These are not particularly good examples, but it symbolises that I think England became interesting because of the art schools. I think if you track back, it was this wartime and post-war engineering activity and technology activity on the one hand, and the art schools on the other. And it used to be said at the good points in the AA's history that it was more like an art school than an architecture school, which I've always taken to be a compliment rather than a condemnation. And the art schools, after all, begat a whole lot of subsequent things in the lap over between technology and art. And so the guy on the right is a very key figure, though never a member of art. I mean, again, he was probably older than Warren. I can't quite place his age. He was older than us anyhow. But a very interesting guy called Gordon Pask, supposed to be the inventor of cybernetics. And he was a friend of Cedric Price, and if you look carefully, you'll see that the Fun Palace was co-designed between Joan Littlewood, the theatre entrepreneur, and Cedric and Gordon Pask. He was a Cambridge engineer who, with his wife, used to tour the northern dance halls with a very primitive light show. He then was used to invite, later on he had an extraordinary loft in Richmond-on-Thames. Why Richmond? He said, I've moved there because it's got more coffee bars. And he was, in the bottom slide, he was involved in a piece of exhibition called Cybernetic Serendipity, organised by Jascha Reichart at the ICA in the beginning of the 70s. My dates are always dodgy. You'll find tomorrow when I'm looking at the archive, I'm hopeless about dates. I'm not very interested. But he did these interactive robots who would respond to each other. And he was an absolute nutter. He had this extraordinary rooftop laboratory, I suppose, with dogs walking around it, innumerable wires, and several young ladies who were sort of in love with him. He wrote musicals. He painted surrealist paintings. His watch never showed the actual time, but another time. And he was constantly popping pills. But he survived quite well for some years. And Ron and I used to go and visit him, and Cedric, of course, used to go and visit him. And he was a sort of one of those people. He was brought in even on normal AA crits. And quite interesting to have a man, somebody's showing something with fire escapes and, ramps and so on. Somehow Gordon Pask would comment on them quite intelligently, I believe. And his lectures were extraordinary because he would deliberately mispronounce words. And he usually had a lot of dandruff on his shoulders and a sort of I'm showing two photos. I think one maybe a bit younger than the other. One where he's relatively smartened up on the left and less smartened up, more typical on the right. And he was he would do this mispronouncing of names and clocks. The whole thing was Looney Tunes, but he invented the joystick thing, and he used to invite us to, which later on you could buy in W.H. Smith's, as a sort of toy, and had worked for the RAF. He was quite sort of legit underneath this complete eccentricity. Now, moving on from eccentricity, again, another character that I didn't have much. Oh, I'm going to go over. I'm going to overrun. Sorry, guys. Sorry. Don't hold that up. It's useless. And Bruce Lacey was a sort of funky, toy-like version of the same thing, of sort of silly things and so on. And of course, the other reference, meanwhile, was Buckminster Fuller. I think, all paths lead to Buckminster Fuller in many ways. And I was going to say more of that, but if you're holding that notice up already, I've ignored it. And the other person was Peter Rainer Banham, who interestingly, by chance, lived across the street from me. And we'd done about 2 archigrams, and suddenly my then wife bumped into his wife in the street, and she said, "Come over on Fridays. We have a sort of soiree." And it was where I met Buckminster Fuller and Richard Meyer and Manfredo de Fury and Eames, and of course the people who taught me, the Smithsons, who said, why has the cat brought this in, things like that. And Cedric Price and Jim Sterling, who hated each other, would try to come on alternative Fridays. And people like Richard Hamilton, the painter. So this was the sort of scene of the people older than me. And that was all swirling around. Now, another point I want to make is that David Greene had a whole month being taught directly by Bucky Fuller in Nottingham. And I think it obviously, when you actually have a reasonable period of time with the actual person, you see the warts and all. You see their sort of boring features. You see their paranoid features. You see their shorthand and who they like to drink with, etc., etc. Ron Herron had been the student of a man called Julius Posner, who had been an émigré from Berlin, another of the probably Marxist Jewish émigrés. Stayed in London, and Ron did evening classes, but was lucky enough to be taught by Posner, who had, in fact, has written a definitive book on Pelzig, and in fact worked for Pelzig. And because I'm a bit of a Pelzig fan, I'm fascinated by that connection and what it may have made. And then in my own case, I was taught by James Gowan, who was one of the co-authors of the Leicester Building with Jim Sterling. And then in 5th year, directly by Peter Smithson. Now, the funny thing is, of course, I'd admired the Smithsons from afar, from being an assistant in an office in Bournemouth, looking at them in photos. And then the first day I was in one end of the AA building, and I saw Peter Smithson going up past the glass windows on the way to the gents' loo. I thought, I have arrived. And the next week, I went to an exhibition at the building centre, and there were the Smithsons in silver suits. And that was the scene around the time when Archigram started. It obviously, this direct link thing, I think, is in a way important, not because it's sort of name-dropping and showing off, but because somehow when you've seen the people in action, I mean, I can remember in the Banham Friday evenings, I, as an innocent, would go across there thinking they're going to talk about architectural philosophy and their positions and their ideas. What did they talk about? Air tickets. Because you had no internet at the time. How can I change this ticket that goes through Delhi in order to go through, I don't know, somewhere else? Who was shagging who? And that fucker has got the professorship, not me. And it's basically that sort of conversation. Now, the archigrams themselves, I'll track quickly over this because you can look at them all upstairs. Number 1 was done on a Ronio machine in the office that David and I both worked with, which was called James Cuban Partners. And the big page was a mixture of stuff from the group of people who used to meet in the evening, roughly in the area where I now live. We all lived in that Swiss cottage area. And included other people who were not really in the end part of Archigram, but were part of the circuit of people who used to meet together. As soon as the larger group decided to do competitions, it very rapidly broke down into them, us, and somebody else. And David Greene, Mike Webb, and I were the people who made the first Archigram. And the other thing I want to point out is that all 6 of us went to different schools of architecture. No 2 went to the same school. Some did night courses. Dennis Crompton went to a proper university school. 3 of us went to art schools, and then I moved on to the AA. And Ron Herron did night school. So it's a very disparate. And I think in a way that was its strength, that we weren't peas in a pod, that we all had different angles in on things, and we were a sort of alliance. I think I won't go over the ins and outs of the various issues of the magazine, because it's all upstairs, and it's now produced in a I think not desperately overpriced large box by these guys in New York, of facsimiles which look about 93% like the originals. David and I get a bit sort of petulant over the fact the paper's the wrong paper, or the ink's the wrong ink or something. But to hell with that. It's pretty much what they were about. And they were perversely and deliberately different sizes. We played every game you could play with the standard offset litho plate. There's a standard plate that most printers had the same plate. And we'd cut it in 4, cut it in a big and a small, cut it into 6, cut it long ways, cut it short ways, folded it, put it in a packet, etc., 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 until we. That was our sort of game. That the next archigram should never be predictable. This, the line drawing of this is upstairs. Just after this thing was published in the Sunday Times Colour Supplement, it was seen by all the students that I was about to face. I was pulled in after doing many, many crits. I think I was supposed to be good at crits, so that they got me teaching eventually. And I was to be the assistant to the 5th year master, which is a humble role generally, except everybody had seen this thing in a publication seen by millions, not obscure, and they thought, what the hell, we're going to be taught by this loony. I had to sort of prove them that I was helpful and useful and sensible and sort of armchair psychologist, and didn't do any drawing for about a year. The Plug-in City project was actually predated by this, the Montreal Tower, and post-dated by the Instant City, which was done when I first was brought in to teach for 3 or 4 months at UCLA in Los Angeles. And this is also part of that same project, which was grabbed by the Deutsches Architektenmuseum as an extra. I sold them some drawings, and they said, "Can we have one?" The guy said, "Can I have an extra one free?" And he grabbed this one, which is quite an interesting one for him to want to grab free. I got a new book coming. I'm going to pre-advertise the new book, which is printed, ready to be sold in about the end of February. And I will make sure that M+ has ample copies of it, which includes a much more detailed description of the cross-section of Plug-in City and this drawing. But as time went on, my own drawings became more sort of thoughtful, I suppose is the word. They became more speculative about things I couldn't really draw, even experiences that I'd never. I personally was never on drugs, but I used to imagine floating and things like that, and dreams, and I tried to draw it. Ron Herron, as I say, was a night school guy. He'd built a building that was published in a book called one of the Penguin books on modern architecture. At the age of 23, somehow, without being fully qualified, he'd done the Starcross School, which has now been pulled down in Gray's Inn Road, and extraordinary. And he was of extraordinary creative talent. And when he sort of joined in with us younger ones of Archigram, his way of communicating, I think, is extraordinary, because his drawings like this are really, in a sense, popular, to use it in its positive sense. I think the idea of doing a popular drawing, and the fact that the Walking City is still the most iconic of the Archigram drawings, without doubt, and in fact doesn't exist. So when a guy came over from New York, from the Gilman Paper Company, to buy some drawings from several of us, which eventually passed on to the Museum of Modern Art. He went to Ron's house and said, "Can I see the Walking City drawing?" And Ron opened a drawer with a series of components. It exists as a series of components that could be then put together. So there are pieces of leg and pieces of side and pieces of porthole and so on, that once you join them together make variants on the vessel. And I think I've always been interested in the notion that this project, not exactly in its mannerisms, but in its statement, should be seen against the Unité d'Habitation on the one hand, and Hans Hollein's aircraft carrier Maud in Austria on the other. The notion of the total object as city, in Ron's case, movable. But this proposition, I think, is still an extraordinarily strong proposition. I remember Ron and Warren, and I managed to meet the guy and put it in the Archigram file. They said they kept talking about an AA student who they'd remembered who'd made a model city the size of a piano. They kept describing this thing. They said, this whole city in a model the size of a piano. And I found the guy eventually, years later, and he'd put up a sort of rather ordinary high-rise in Victoria, near Victoria Station. Never mind, this notion of the city as a single building is a pervasive one, and I think to be returned to. You've got the silver paper model upstairs of this interchange project, which, as I remember, was done quite quickly by Ron and Warren. Now, Ron and Warren had grouped together quite a lot and kept coming second in competitions, which is how I got to know about them. And I think they were a very necessary pairing. So in a way you could say that they existed before Archigram as a group existed, as a sort of item, in the sense that Warren was the thinker. But this is oversimplistic. Again, everything's oversimplistic at this rapid fire. But Ron was the drawer and Warren was the thinker. That's the easy explanation, because it's not quite as simple as that, and Warren did draw. He enjoyed drawing less, and Ron was by no means not a thinker. Ron was a very kind and calm person who secretly would get the most angry of anybody about crass architecture. You know, we might huff and puff about it, and he would keep quiet until occasionally he would just explode. And we used to have a saying in Archigram, this will upset them. We never said who the them were, but we all knew who the them were. So somebody would draw something, somebody look at it, this will upset them. And that was very important, and I think leads to a sort of proposition that a certain amount of anger is very important in creativity. Now, that's not a popular thing to say, but I believe it to be so. When you really want to get it, you do so. And I think that's what Archigram was about. I think it was jolly, but it was also angry. And Ron would do things to do with the back garden and the idea of a B-52 bomber moored in the back of a Woodford garden, which is where he lived. And I hope interestingly, comparing Ron's version of the Instant City with mine was drawn sitting in Los Angeles, sitting in an apartment near to UCLA, but thinking about it being located in an English field. Ron, on the other hand, living a couple of miles away in Brentwood, Los Angeles, was drawing it at that San Diego-Santa Monica freeway intersection, which was somewhere that we passed through almost daily, and actually put the Instant City there where he was at that time. Whether that says anything about our personalities or not, I don't. And again, of course, collaged the people in front of him. He sometimes got into trouble because the people were too beautiful, particularly the ladies. And he would be considered totally politically incorrect now because they were all rather beautiful and sometimes exposed bare flesh. David Greene, I think, is also poetic. There's other sorry, I just have to talk about this. That there were substratas because David and Warren were critical and poetic. I think Ron and I were just hackers in a way. I mean, all this is grossly oversimplified. And Dennis was a maker, did stuff, electrics, taught us all how to weld, taught us how to deal with electric tappets and sunk bolts and stuff when we used to make exhibitions. And Mike is a genius. Mike is just a crazy, crazy, mad, extraordinary genius. I don't know whether you have these drawings in your collection. I think they're very interesting because David's thesis project was very influenced by Friedrich Kiesler's Endless House, which is another sideways conversation we can go down. But involves, kind of mimics of space technology with mimics of Corbusier worked into the Kiesler proposition. And there's David in an inflatable. I mean, we all made inflatables. He made this rather good inflatable, which, of course, for those who know about these things, calls a sort of reference to Rainer Bannerman and Francois Dallegray's enclosure with the home is not a house conversation. Now, I can't date it. I can't say which came first. But the conversation in the air, we all, by the way, made inflatables. You'd go to Woolworths and get lots of PVC sheet and sellotape and a Hoover. And the thing would just about go up for about 5 minutes. And then you had done your inflatable, just as everybody did a bucket dome. David Greene's, one of his greatest inventions was the rock plug and the log plug. The notion that apparatus and services and all sorts of things could appear anywhere in the landscape, covered by a rock or a log, or a quasi-rock and a quasi-log. And when we started doing the exhibition, I would add to it I have to do a further anecdote. When we started making the travelling show, which was the progeny of the big Viennese show, in about 1992 or 1, he took the cover of Archigram 6, which shows the rock plug, the lock plug, a garden, lawn, this locally available world unseen networks, and a dog. And for the London show, because we had access to lots of stuff, we included the dog, a stuffed dog, for the first time. And every subsequent show, and I think this included Korea and various rather far-flung places, wanted the stuffed dog as well. And we'd also done a replica of our original Archigram office in Endell Street. And the subsequent exhibitions wanted the Endell Street as well. So gradually the exhibition would grow. It was dangerous to have too many more referential ideas because the thing just got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, including the stuffed dog. Dennis is the way, in some ways, the most enigmatic member of the group. I think, in fact, coming across erroneously as the most straightforward. He had, after all, been to the Manchester University School of Architecture. He had had a postgraduate course in urban planning. And had worked on the South Bank as the youngest member of the South Bank connection. And he very rapidly was the person you would refer to, and actually became, and he's only died fairly recently, he became really the keeper of the Archigram flame. I think all the publications about Archigram as a whole, and I see these ladies nodding because it's true, Dennis really virtually did the box that is now on sale. Dennis virtually, in fact, did do the Big Blue Book, which is now republished as a 3/4 size Big Blue Book, and the little blue and green books. He was the chronicler and the technical director, if you like, and occasionally did do drawing, but not very many, of which this is a very telling drawing, The Computer City, which, of course, anticipates a whole lot of conversations way before time. Mike Webb is the genius. This is a fourth-year project for the Furniture Manufacturers Association in High Wycombe, loosely known as the Furniture Factory. And it was exhibited in the Museum of Modern Art while he was still a student. This was the Sin Centre, also produced as his fifth-year project, shown here in a number of different manifestations, both the original model on the right, or one of the original models, and a later version drawn on the left, and a much later drawn on the top. And this project was failed by the then Regent Street Polytechnic, even though it was hanging up in the Museum of Modern Art with a narrative by Kenneth Frampton. This is way back in the 60s. And later, of course, his preoccupation with Temple Island, which is based in Henley, which is where he was born. And I think he may even still be drawing this. Certainly, when we did Archigram 10, this recent publication, a year ago, he was still producing drawings based on the car version many years later. His projects are legend. The Take Up Thy Bed and Walk, the Cushicle, and the Rent-A Wall. I think you have that, or a version of it. I think you have the original version here. This is a later one that he did. He's always working over a project. He's the only person I know who can work over a project 50 years later and still manage to get matter out of it. And Warren Chalk, look at Warren as an early Warren on the top right-hand side, when he and Ron Herron were euphemistically known as George Raft and Steve McQueen, and would wear Ivy League suits. Would go to a special shop in London, the only place where you could get Ivy League suits, and look more American. And at that time would smoke Lucky's or Lucky Strike. One would do Lucky's and one would do Camel. I think Warren was the Lucky, and I think Ron was Camel. And then suddenly Ron sprouted a beard, went into denims, and smoked Chitan. And I think that tells you about the scene. And Warren really developed the capsule idea, which of course was much discussed when we were working for Taylor Woodrow Construction, which I haven't got time to go into now. Warren would sit there ostensibly dealing with a piece of railway land, actually with architecture d'aujourd'hui stacked there, Casabella stacked there, and Japan Architect stacked there, and the capsule was well in conversation, as were ideas such as this. So when he did do a drawing, it was very telling, but he didn't sort of produce vast numbers. Finally, a run through what is currently or has been recently available. On the top left, the book, which, as I say, is now produced really by Dennis, in fact, done by Dennis, now reprinted 3/4 size, I think, to advantage. The facsimiles box coming from the United States. Recently, a year ago, I gathered together a whole lot of people who I thought were in the spirit of Archigram, and with the help of a very helpful, at the time, Swiss robotics company, we managed to publish Archigram 10. The old original Archigram book on the left, bottom left, number 4, which is available was available from a series of publishers who sort of took it on year by year by year. But of course, that's in the days when we couldn't afford to do anything in colour, or the publishers couldn't afford to do anything in colour. Now the newer books, of course, are all completely in colour. The green and blue 5 and 6 of the Dennis Crompton versions, and I think are very authentic. I think they're very dense. They have things that we said directly without anybody interfering with our opinions. The book by a lady called Hadass. I think quite a good analysis, because she did actually talk to us and listen to us. Unlike, I think, Simon Sadler's book, which is published by a posher publisher, but I think is totally Sadler himself having a kind of political agenda and using Archigram work to support it, and not very interested in the visuals. And to me, anybody who writes about Archigram who isn't really looking at the stuff rather than having their own predisposition about political agenda or consumerist agenda, etc., is a wanker. And finally, on the bottom right, number 9 was produced in Tokyo when we had the Mito exhibition in Izuzaki's building with the tower. A beautiful, probably the most beautiful catalogue that's ever been done about Archigram, and it won several awards, I believe. Hard to find, but beautiful, just as a beautiful book. And that's, I understand I've overrun somewhat.
Well, first of all, thank you, Peter, for your talk. It's very informative and inspiring. Do you want some water? Oh, you got it? Okay. Shirley asked me to do 2 things. I remember both. One is to explain my connection or relationship with Peter. The second one is to initiate this conversation by asking Peter a question. So I tried. I think I can, in a way, combine those 2 tasks. First of all, talking about the connection, our relationship. So I want to invite Peter to go back to 1977. It was meant to be a surprise, but I couldn't help just to ask him about 77. And Peter said right away, that's a competition. And you propose the theme and then you judge it. It's the Shinkanchiku residential design competition run by the Japan Architect magazine. Actually, at the time, it was already fairly well known. And so the theme, which is hard for me, I can see it here, is comfort in the metropolis. So my first question, actually I have more than one question. Why comfort in metropolis as a theme of that competition?
I'm trying to remember back what I would have been thinking at the time. I think it was probably, on the one hand, to do with the fact that a lot of brilliant and tricky architecture, clever architecture, is very uncomfortable. You know, it's okay. You don't think about what people are doing in it. You just think how its mannerisms are, its technologies, and so on. And then I think now that was probably the answer at that time, and the answer I would give now is the notion of comfort. I think we are scared of discomfort. I mean intellectual discomfort. But that's I probably wouldn't have been saying that now. This is the old man saying in the current political and academic situation, I would say we are afraid of discomfort. We all want to say the right things and all smooth and da-da-da. At that time, it was actually quite straight up and down. It was like, the famous wheat belt chair or something. It's great, but don't attempt to sit on it.
There were plenty of discomfort around.
And I think that also is probably an excuse for making smoothie, roundy things.
Okay, thank you. And then this person there, unfortunately, only Eco can read them. Well, too fuzzy even for Eco to read them. So I don't think there's a... So the person's name is Rodney Place.
Oh, yeah.
He taught me in the Midwest of the United States. The school was called Ball State University. And from what I understand, you wrote the recommendation letter for him to get that job.
Well, I've written lots of recommendations for people to get. Sometimes I've written recommendations to get them out of the way. There's one particular person who I managed to get a professorship in another London School of Architecture, so to clear the decks in the Bartlett without the irritation of him being too clever by half. But that's a digression. Rodney Place, yes, he was never central to my scene. I mean, I always thought he was a bit not exactly phony, but a bit over sort of self-consciously arty. You might think of me as an arty animal, but there's a certain bit of me that gets irritated by the self-consciously arty, the sort of too clever by half, you know. But, you know, if you take a world view, yes, he was a good guy, and somewhere like Ball State probably just needed somebody as arcane as that.
By the way, Ball State is in a town called Muncie, Indiana. I wish I have a slide to show you, but let me describe it to you. Very, very simple. If you go out from Muncie in any directions for miles, it's only cornfields. It's really in the heartland of the United States. There's nothing but cornfields.
Can I digress on that? So I once, some years ago, was with Tom Main, who I know very well, and we were sitting in USC, which is a place neither of us were associated with. And somehow, in a question and answer, we both got very shirty about the middle of America. He from the point of view of a sort of coastal person, me from a Euro position. We were both being really nasty about the middle of America, which neither of us like very much, shall I put it mildly.
Well, usually it's considered as the flying over land. Right. But I was there twice for altogether 5 years. So I'm beef eaters, as we proudly would claim. But anyway, so Rodney Place was there for 2 years. I studied under him. So I would consider, I have the right to be considered as your grand student because Rodney studied at AA during the years Peter taught there. Peter taught at AA for 25 years. I double-checked that number holds true. So anyway, and here, as you can see, is second prize Peter gave to Rodney. I remember vaguely, I checked another version of the magazine. There's an English edition of it. I couldn't find online. And basically would give you an idea. The project Rodney did is about living in the underground, in the tubes. I don't know if you remember that. But his drawing is very difficult to decipher. But however, the only thing I appreciate very much is that already at that time there's a kind of a convention of drawing modern architecture, but apparently this is not. Far from it. There's a kind of a classicism kind of expressed in the drawing, probably even in the architecture. So I thought that was really interesting. And then at that time, I was already studying with him, so he suggested, more than suggested, he really pushed me, you should apply to AA, get out of the cornfields. I thought I was just finding the cornfields interesting. And then I wasn't very sure. And then, however, when I saw the fourth prize for the same competition, and then that kind of work for me, it's really fascinating. Not actually the architect. His name, a lot of people, older people, maybe not a lot. A few of you would know. Is Peter Wilson, who's Australian, And later on, also, both Rodney and Peter Wilson became tutors at AA. And he's drawing, because my I studied sort of a second-hand Beaux-Arts kind of a stuff, so that's more like in my alley, that kind of a drawing. So I was telling Rodney, AA was interesting as a place to go. I wanted to study with Peter Wilson. And then I was admitted, and turned out the tuition tag was so high that I stayed in Muncie, Indiana instead. But still, the whole experience with Rodney, yeah. So from second-hand Beaux-Arts to second-hand AA now. So I can show. I don't know if you have seen this. I want to show it to you. No, I'm just not holding close enough. I don't know, Peter, have you seen this? That was about 9 years later from 1977. So I entered Shinkin-Chiku.
This is you.
Yeah. Yeah. As you can tell, I never had a haircut since 77. But I thought, although it's not, of course. Well, I mean, I'm not a product, but you can see the AA influence there. It's actually, if I could sum up, which I have to, because there are some Hong Kong youth students and faculties here, I can't give them out what I wanted to say tomorrow. I have to save some of that. But anyway, it's kind of going after some true interest of myself, probably like Peter Wilson did or Ronnie Place did, has very little to do with what's fashionable at the time. Although it became some of the directions people take became fashionable, especially like Zaha, for one, becomes a very definitive style. And it wasn't the idea at all. I don't think people know what... There are a couple of things Zaha was interested, and people probably never knew or just forget about it. Rodney and Zaha, they were classmates. So because of that, when Zaha worked on her projects in China, especially in Beijing, when he came in, always would call and we get together. And mostly it's about me listening to her to talk about her classmates. I happen to know quite a few. But anyway, so I was into that kind of a work. I wasn't sure at all if I wanted to build until much later. From that point, probably 8 years later in the early 1990s, there was really kind of an urge. And then I was in Europe traveling around, looking at buildings, and then went back to Beijing. I started to realize there were opportunities to build. So the connection, I cut it short, this is taking too long, is actually through Rodney Place. Not only that, I learned a bit about AA, and then I discovered this important figure called Peter Cook. So, and then of course, I like many of the people who learned about Archigram and Peter Cook and others. So put it, if I could put it in one sentence, the feeling I had, it wasn't discover exactly something different or fresh. I wouldn't use those terms, but rather I felt I myself was liberated. And ever since, so that sense of emancipation, sort of, I hold very dearly. I hope it's always with me, but I think when I also get older, I'm losing it. Hopefully not too fast. So anyway, so that's how kind of really, in a way, I met Peter. And then later on, and we had these and that conversations. It comes back to something. Peter just asked me again, you really want to be an artist? He asked me just outside the elevator again. And now it comes back to the question of art. It's interesting for me. It depends on the periods. Sometimes I really think architecture is a lot more exciting than art, but sometimes the other way around. So I want you were talking about going to art school and doing architecture or doing something that you don't really have to define it as either art or architecture. I'm not curious about that.
Gosh, there's a lot of meat in this conversation. I mean, there's a fascinating trails when you start talking about the Rodney Place and Peter Wilson and so on. Peter Wilson does buildings, some of them very good, some one or two brilliant, and some always good. And when I visited his office some years ago in Münster, his wife Julia gives him a room, a little eerie little room up in the office where he does his drawings. She says, Peter does his drawings in here. And they're exquisite little drawings, and sometimes they're little books. But of course, they also do buildings. And he has probably carried on in refining the drawings and, making buildings as well. Whereas most of the other people mentioned haven't done buildings, have even sort of scoffed at doing buildings, or have found all sorts of intellectual reasons for not doing buildings, or artistic reasons. I think the thing about being an artist, I mean, I regard myself as intrinsically, I never thought I could draw. I couldn't draw as well as other people in my class. I have found tricks by which it looks as if I can draw. And I now show in galleries, and I sell prints and drawings to the extent of them being a taxable item these days. And I don't do much building. I would prefer it with the reverse, but I'm so keen to express. And there's a lot of hybrid territories. I was trying to explain in another lecture, and we'll do tomorrow night. Each of us has our own. I mean, I've seen a lot of Nigel Coates in recent times, and we've discussed this thing because he did quite a lot of buildings in a spurt and then completely stopped, but he still does furniture and occasionally drawings. And, there are other people such as C.J. Lim, who we were talking about just now, who has never done a building, but has worked in offices much more than the other people, not generally known, and can design exquisitely and accurately. So this is something else. I think it's partly circumstances, partly... There was a period at the A, a long period, of which Archigram was really the beginning. And I think just to deal with that a little bit, I think already by the time Peter Wilson and Rodney Place and so on were teaching, we were already sort of old guys. We were, we'd been doing our stuff. We'd had a lot of exposure. And we were friends with them, but we were not quite of the same group. It was already beginning to be something else, and that was... and it's also speaking on that level, it was very interesting in Shenzhen now, where we've just been. Nearly all the people came up to me, my ex-students, were Bartlett There were very few AA. Had we put the clock back 20 years ago, when I used to go to things, everybody would come up who'd been AA students. Now, it's not just me, it's also an age thing. And I don't know what's happening to the AA people right now, but the Bartlett ones seem to be the ones building. But I must admit to having brought up, when I went to the Bartlett, brought up a lot of AA teachers. And the drawing thing started to take off so that they were doing the AA stuff better than the AA. And so but it all seems to slightly die down now in that drawing is, as soon as you start going to the computer, it does things too fast and too consistently. And there's a strong area of indulgence when we make hand drawings, which, as somebody said yesterday, can be considered as time to think, but can also be downright indulgence. But maybe indulgence itself is a quality, it should be a constituent of architecture. Now, that's a tricky proposition, which we haven't got time really to discuss, but I just suddenly think of it, would posit it as a notion to discuss. Is indulgence a legitimate constituent of architectural development?
Let's end for that, because we really want to hear from the audience questions. And
Okay.
We would love that too. So I'm gonna just start. Yes.
They better be good.
We're gonna share one mic. That's all right. Yep. Yep. And then we can.
Hi, thank you so much both of you for your amazing lecture. I'm a student from HKU. I'm year 2, and something I'm curious as that, well, in this lecture you've mentioned a lot about the external, so like the external influence and what you have produced in the group. I'm actually quite interested in the internal, like the workings and the collaboration between the 6 of you, because you've mentioned you all come from different schools, and they all have different preferences and tastes. How does, there's so many strong egos in the same room, how does this create a work that you want to, like the work that you are all okay or accepted with? Because that's the question.
It's in the past, 3 are dead, and one is far flung, sort of being rescued at the moment in San Diego. David and I still live near to each other, but we haven't drawn anything together since we had to do an extension to an exhibition about 15 years ago. And so we meet over coffee and grumble about things and have different opinions in discussion groups. But it would work in very simply that we very rarely all work together. It's only about 2 projects. You can say absolutely probably not even that. But in 2s and 3s, so that there would be an exhibition in Oslo that was done by Dennis and me. Then there'd be a small building for Rod Stewart's swimming pool that was done by Ron and Dennis. Then there would be some Archigram projects that were done by David and Mike. They would tend to be, tend to be circumstantial. There was a big job that we won, which was for Monte Carlo, when it was largely done without Ron Herron on board, except by correspondence. And then as soon as we won the competition, he jacked in his American job and came over and then worked on it, but it never got built, but many of his drawings on it. It would vary. And there was some who were less inclined to jump to sort of drawing anything, and probably, as I keep saying, Ron and I, who would sort of draw any old thing, somebody said, come and do a sort of, greenhouse for rhubarb tomorrow morning, which not one up, it wouldn't necessarily be anything you want to put in the archive. But, I'm always reminded that you have to know beyond that once a student told me that he'd been working as a holiday job at Foster's, and I said, what did you work on? He said, Luton Airport. Now, if anybody knows Luton Airport, it's quite hard to think of that being a Foster's job, but everybody's got to live. And there are not a lot of things that we've done that would be hidden, but we could do straight up and down if you want to do straight up and down.
And Peter, you did the blue whale in Graz.
Oh, well, that's another conversation. And I did that together with Colin Fournier. And Colin Fournier had worked on the Monte Carlo project with me when he just finished being a student. And actually, he and I spent most of the summer holiday working on that. And I would say he was quite an important conceptual influence in the Monte Carlo building, and similarly in the Blue building. Yet a tangent number 432. Whether the building in Graz can be considered a post-Archigram building is highly discussable. I think what it does do is that it was built on virtually on time and virtually on budget, which for an arts building is pretty unusual. 2.5% over budget and 2 months over date. And it's still working very well. Love it or hate it. I think what it was important is for them saying to people, that all that stuff that you said couldn't be built that we did. What now? If you do Graz, what percentage actually could have been built? I'm not saying 100%, but certainly a greater percentage than would have been thought hitherto. That's my point.
Yeah, I was already at MIT. I was doing a lecture series called One Building. I invited you to come over to talk about that building. I have a question, and then we go back to the audience. So there's a Archigram building, designed not by Archigram people. It's actually Centre Pompidou.
Yeah.
Yeah, so...
Several of our ex-students worked on it. I mean, people who'd been working with us on Monte Carlo, a couple of them went to work on that. They were quite a big part of the team, of the competition team, and some who stayed. And people who'd been students of mine. I mean, Mike Davis and all those guys, they were students of mine. And if they weren't our students, they were Japanese, or they didn't have any French on it. I mean, the French were so bad that they were mostly Italians, English, Italians, and Japanese on it, and a brilliant Irish engineer, of course.
Right. Thank you. So.
I'm glad to see you here because when I was a student, we used to study about your movement. So seeing you face to face means a lot to me. But I have a question because you started the lecture by mentioning that one of your projects were kind of reaction against Le Corbusier's unité d'habitation. But you are taking one of your projects is a movement against Le Corbusier's building, right? You mentioned this.
Did I?
Yeah.
No, I think you got the wrong end of the stick. Sorry.
Huh? Maybe I misunderstood. I'm sorry.
I think you did.
But yeah, maybe. But my question actually is about the line because you're taking part of it. How do you see this project and its future?
None. I think it's not going to happen. I've had to sign all sorts of affidavits that I'm not to say anything about it. And I did actually, in the Venice Biennale 2 years ago, I blew my mouth open, and everybody was amazed that I said, I think the idea is daft. I think, well, and not there. I think the idea of the linear city is an okay idea. I think the idea of the linear city, I think the idea of integrating certain transportation systems is fine. I think the notion of whether the notion of making two walls with a gap in the middle is a good idea, I question. And that again is related to the distance and the height. But the idea of doing it 500 meters tall and trying to do it 50 miles long is bollocks, quite frankly, or whatever word you like to apply. Complete conceptual diarrhea, you know. What else? I think of term after term. Crap. Stupid, idiotic. And to think that you could do it, and all these people, I mean, the people who've been involved on the line, you would be surprised if I listed out all the people, heroes and other, you know, everybody from Gensler to Wolf-Pricks to you name it, you know, and everybody in between. You could think of such an array of people, and some brilliant engineers and some brilliant transportation people. And it's a great wank, you know, and they've sunk all these piles, and they're never going to fill them. And to the idea of putting a sports stadium, whatever, 100 meters up, I mean, it's Looney Tunes. But the idea of the linear city, the idea of using prefabricated housing of a variety of types, of using certain linear systems of connection, there's the expert sitting in the front row, is not stupid. It's the interpretation, which raises a sort of, you know, I'm now sounding like Mr. RIBA member in a sense, you know, like it's a question of how you do it and you know, within what context. I think a wonderful linear city could be done at about 100 meters high, maybe 80 or some such figure, you know, commensurate with easy ways of elevator transfer and stuff like that, and weight of things at the top, and wind. The wind load, that part of the world is such that if you stand 2/3 of the way up it, you get blown over. End of conversation. But the wind tunneling through this presumed arch would blow any boat out unless you build a 300-meter high hill at the back of it to force back the wind. I mean, it starts getting, you know, and I'm probably going to get a knife in the back or something from eastern parts for saying this. Apart from the fact I think the desert sucks anyhow. So.
I think it's a fascinating. Looking at your drawings in the 60s, to hear you say that that's impractical would upset or would surprise a lot of people, because I mean there's always been visionaries in architecture, and you're certainly one of them. And then there's been Jan Kapliki and lots of other people that their things are sort of unbuildable in a way. They sort of test but they're pushing forward the boundaries. And so if NEOM had just been a paper exercise, everybody would be saying, "Oh, isn't that wonderful?" But the fact that they're actually trying to build it, don't you think? I mean, I do agree with you about the 500 meters. I think all the artists' drawings, architects' drawings I've seen, you know, you can only see sort of 20 stories high. You have to think that that's being repeated about 5 more times. What would it actually be like to be in that space? I think what your architecture shows was more of a humanity. You could see the human scale, but it's still incredibly futuristic, and a lot of people would be saying exactly the same, that you can't build that, or, you know.
Well, I think the question of degree, I think if you look at the Plug-in University, which the drawing is upstairs, for example, you know, the escalators are at the correct pitch, the toilets are the right size, there are handrails. You know, it's moderately cautious by the standards of those sorts of things. And I used to get, even at the time, irritated with contemporary sort of, say, French projects, which never seemed to be made of anything in particular, and certainly didn't have handrails, and you didn't quite know how you got up them. So because we had work plodding in offices, and you know, one did have a very straight up and down training. And even at the AA, we had to do housing schemes following exactly the LCC bylaws. You know, I would claim that they weren't as Looney Tunes as the.
No, but did you ever? You must have had people come up to you like Marco Goldschmidt at Richard Rogers, a sort of business person that said, "Look, you just do the creative stuff, and we'll look after the accountancy or the whatever." Did that never happen? Because you were all such an artistic.
Equivalent. Marco was a student of mine who actually managed to get through. Gossip now. Managed to get through his thesis by working with a very clever and hard-working lady.
Hi, I'm also a year 2 student from Hong Kong U, and I have kind of a question that is related to what we're doing as students ourselves. So my question is like, when you were working on the Archigram, right? This was not just the work you were doing at the time. So how did you maintain the momentum as a whole group to continue this for such a long time and to create such a scale of a project?
Well, you have to break that down. You know, again, 10 people with different things. Some of them had already moved to teach in America when the projects were still going on. Some then came back. David went to teach in an art school and then came back. Ron was doing stuff for various other architects. You know, he worked for Sandy Wilson at one period and I think did some stuff, a bit of moonlighting on Milton Keynes and stuff. I mean, there are all sorts of ways, you know, I would write a book or something and mostly teach. I mean, we were mostly teaching in broad terms, not necessarily at the same place. In broad terms, one has probably paid more tax on one's teaching income, such as it was, than on anything else until recent times. It's much more personal and erratic and not quite as simple as it seems. It's as if the Archigram was a portmanteau term, and the group was an alliance and was a series of allies with very different personalities and sometimes different opinions, but agreeing that the sum of its parts, you know, this was greater than the individual. The extraordinary member, and I've spoken less about him, was Mike Webb, who disappeared to America, and a very up and down life. I mean, he was not given tenure in 2 universities and gave up on trying to get tenure, which was so outrageous that there was an article in the Village Voice to which John Haydock, myself, and a whole lot of other worthies put our name, but it still didn't get him the job. But he is so original. I think he's really off almost on a tangent from the rest of us. I would say, if I was an art historian or historian trying to look at our work, I would say there are 5 guys doing this and that, and this, and then there's Mike, who was a sort of lone mad genius. But he liked to be part of it, strangely enough. I say strangely enough because he didn't need to be. And this is my sort of sober assessment. There are about 16 seminars in this, and I would like young folk to continue to be part of them, because when you go, the whole thing about the A and what that did, and what the role played by drawing in a certain piece of architectural culture over a long period of time, and picked up by a number of schools, I would say, each in their own curious way. I would say SciArc continues for me to be the most interesting school in the world at the moment, partly because it's always been run by a designer. Every head of the school has been a designer of interest. That's significant, I think, and that okay, it's all computational now, but that somehow the drawing tradition has affected that school. There was Cooper Union at a certain period, which was the place that we were looking over our shoulder to. But when I was a student, and this came up in conversation yesterday, the school that the A had been looking over its shoulder to was Liverpool, because of Sterling and all that. But then by the time I got there, that had gone. But we were looking over our shoulder, interestingly, down the street to the less posh school, which was the Regent Street Polytechnic. And there's in the Orient, there's another conversation number 903, which is what was going on in the Poly. And that Mike Webb and another guy called Steve Osgood and some other people were the Bauerlists that Banham picked up on. But that then 2 of the key people, which was two guys from that class, jumped into our class at the AA. So there was they still felt that how interesting the Poly was, it was better to be at the AA, because that was where the scene was. etc., etc., etc. Now we can.
I know, etc., etc. To be continued in HKU tomorrow if you can join. No, but again, thank
Tomorrow,
you.
yeah, do come tomorrow night because it'll be different. And
Yeah. But
sort
thank
of
you.
different.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Young Ho. Yeah. Thank you all for coming.